Welcome to this presentation. In this presentation, I'm going to be discussing the Kawa model. I'm going to look at the development of this model, the key assumptions, the main focus, and then at the end, we're going to talk a little bit about the application of this model in occupational therapy practice. So Kawa is a Japanese word which means river. So this model really is about the flow of life, with the river representing one's life. Now let's get into it. A little bit about the background of this model. It was developed by Dr. Michael Iwama. Dr. Michael Iwama is originally from Japan, and he developed it with fellow Japanese OTs. This model is fairly recent compared to the other occupational therapy conceptual models. It was developed in the early 2000s out of a need, really, where Michael and other Japanese occupational therapists were trying to work on applying conceptual models that were developed in the Western world into their local context. And they were finding it a little bit complicated to actually articulate the occupational therapy concepts and then to address the occupational issues. So then they engaged in loads of research using the grounded theory approach, which is normally used when people are developing theories with multiple focus groups. And by the end of that study, they were then able to come up with the first version of the Kawa model, which uses the river as a metaphor, with the river representing one's life. This conceptual model is culturally sensitive. Of course, it depends on which culture we're looking at, but it's culturally sensitive, particularly in many cultures that are non-Western cultures. It's a model that is useful in developing therapeutic rapport with our service users and gaining information through self-report. Once the service user gets an understanding of the metaphor, it becomes easier for them to actually express the challenges that they'll be experiencing in terms of their occupational performance. It becomes easy for them to articulate their assets or their strengths, which can all be then used to improve their occupational performance. This model has also been found to be to allow for greater flexibility when working with service users from different backgrounds. Even though this model has been developed based on the Japanese context, it has actually been applied in many other contexts. As you will see, there's a reference that I put in the list where you can actually visit the Kawa Model website to see the different case studies where the Kawa Model has been used and the different contexts in which it has been used. So it's a very flexible model to use. Coming to the key assumptions, the first assumption for the Kawa model is that occupation is inseparably embedded in nature and viewed in cooperation with nature and society. So if you look at the other conceptual models that have been developed in the West, you'll see that they've got concepts like person, separate concept, occupation, and then environment. But then for the Kawa model, occupation is not separated from the person or the environment. It's actually viewed in an inseparable way together with the society as well as together with nature. The second key assumption is that a person's occupations and well-being reflect upon and become the responsibility of the whole group. So this notion, it aligns very well with many contexts, particularly in the global south, be it South America and Africa and many other parts of Asia, where its occupations are viewed more in terms of the whole group, and these are called collective occupations. If you see literature coming from South Africa by Ramgondo, Cronenberg, and others, from South America, Maltifano and others, you actually realize that there's an emphasis on collective occupations, the responsibility of the whole group. For example, for me, where I come from Africa, and where I come from, if you meet one person and you ask them, how are you? They can actually, it's not uncommon for them to respond to you saying, we are fine or we are doing well. So even if the person is an individual, when they're responding to you in terms of well-being, they're actually responding on behalf of their family or on behalf of a group or on behalf of a society. So the focus of the Kawa model is actually applicable in many other contexts apart from just the Japanese context. There's also the African philosophy of Unu or Ubuntu. In Zulu, it's Ubuntu, but in my language, Shona, it's Unu. It's a philosophy about which says that a person can only be a person as a result of other people. So that collective focus is very much emphasized on when we're using the Kawa model. The third assumption is that reasoning and reality are situational. Therefore, the general theories cannot be applied in all circumstances. So it's not a one size fits all. So the Kawa model is very flexible to allow for that adaptation. And then the last key concept is that ideas and opinions are not accepted on their own merit, but perceptions, thoughts, opinions, and feelings, as well as beliefs and values, they also need consideration. So we can't say we are working with individuals using a holistic view in occupational therapy if we're neglecting the other parts, like people's perceptions, people's opinions, people's feelings, or people's beliefs or cultural values. So the Kawa model actually allows us to explore those areas which might be explored to a lesser extent in other contexts. Looking at the areas of focus for the Kawa model, the emphasis is actually harmony between self and context, and there is also not much focus on independence. If you want to compare the Kawa model to the other models that were developed in the Western world, you realize that the conceptual models developed in the West, they tend to emphasize independence, of which independence on its own within the field of occupational therapy or critical occupational therapy, it's actually a controversial term. It's still debatable. So the Kawa model doesn't primarily focus on independence. It primarily focuses on harmony between self and the context. And well-being within the Kawa model is being looked at as an unimpeded life flow, where life is flowing according to the desires of the community and the individuals in that particular context. The Kawa model also looks at being embedded in relationships, belonging and interdependence rather than individualism. So the notion of collectivism, it's still coming through with the Kawa model. So there's no rigid explanation of function in the Kawa model, but the key things are about harmony between self and the context. Now, moving on to look at the concepts within this model. There are basically four concepts: environmental factors, life circumstances and problems, life flow and health, as well as personal factors and resources. So initially, when Michael was trying to work out a way of presenting the concept following the pattern of conceptual models developed in the West, we have the PO, there's a diagram with 3 circles, like a Venn diagram, and then we have CMOP-E also as a diagram. So he tried to do that, and then realized that all the 4 concepts, they were actually linked to one another. So it becomes difficult to articulate the concepts by using a diagram like this. So as a result, the best way or the best approach to do this was to actually use the river metaphor because it provided better representation and it also provided meaning. So for the river metaphor, Michael describes the source of the river as the point of birth and the mouth of the river as the end of life. So if you look at this image, on the right side, the top image on the right side is actually showing a cross-section of the river, and it's showing that the river is flowing very well as compared to the picture at the bottom, where you can actually see that there's a lot of silt in the river, a lot of sediments, such that the flow of the river is now shallow. There are also a lot of rocks, which are restricting the flow of the river. So in the river metaphor, from the point at which the person is, upstream represents the past and downstream represents the future. And occupational therapy focuses on removing or circumventing barriers in order to facilitate occupational engagement. And that is the flow of the river. So using this model really depends on the context. It depends on the understanding of the therapist as well as the background of the client. I find this model to be easier to explain to a wide range of clients as long as they can relate to a river. And it's applicable in wider contexts. Even though this was developed in Japan, there are rivers in many other places, many other countries and continents, which makes the metaphor applicable to wider audiences. Take, for example, for me, I come from Zimbabwe, and the river, I find this concept very easy to apply in terms of therapy, because culturally, I can easily relate with the river, because in my culture, the river is very much associated with life. The traditional settlements were built along the rivers. The rivers are considered as a source of food. The rivers are considered as a meeting place. Some traditional games actually take place at the river. The river can be associated with religious practices or rituals. The river can also be associated with livelihoods. The animals, they get their water from the river. So many occupations actually linked to the river, which makes that concept easily relatable in other contexts where people are familiar with how rivers are. So it becomes easy to apply this model when you're working with a person who can easily understand the concept of the river. According to Michael, an optimal state of well-being in one's life or the river can be metaphorically portrayed as an image of a strong, deep, unimpeded flow. So when the person is experiencing health and well-being, if we look at the river metaphor, it means the river is flowing unimpeded and there is a strong flow and the river is deep. So that will be the aim when we are providing interventions using the Kawa model to achieve a flow that is unimpeded, strong, deep flow. Now, looking at the elements for the Kawa model, there is the water. So the water represents the flow in health, an individual person's life or life of a whole group. So it could be focusing on an individual or focusing on a group, depending on who the client is, because we know in occupational therapy, our clients can either be an individual, community, or group of people, or a family. So the water represents the flow in health. The rocks represent life circumstances and problems. They vary in size and they impede the water's flow. For example, injuries, illnesses, health conditions, misfortunes, or circumstances that are hindering people from participating in meaningful occupations. And then we have driftwood. Driftwood represents personal assets. If you think of the capabilities approach where we look at the person's strengths or assets, the driftwood represents the assets or an individual's strengths, but the driftwood also represents liabilities. I think sometimes this is where the Kawa model can be sort of like ambiguous when we are looking at this and this at this metaphor. The driftwood can either be assets or liabilities. So these can either help or hinder the flow of the river. And then looking at the river bottom and the sides, these represent the environment. So that could be your physical environment, social environment. And then we have the spaces between these elements. So the spaces between these elements provide opportunities for occupational therapy interventions to shift elements and create new pathways of flow, especially when the flow of the river is being restricted by situations or circumstances. Right, now moving on to the application. The first diagram there to the left, it shows us the different elements constricting water flow. So if you look at the sides of the river and the riverbed, you can actually see that there's a lot of silt and sediments building up, making the river to become shallow. There are also lots of rocks that are actually impeding the flow of the river. But we can also identify some driftwood there. So those are the elements that could constrict the flow. So it might be that the flow is being restricted by the environment, which is represented by the bottom of the river and the sides of the river, or it might be the flow is being or the flow of a person's life is being restricted by health conditions or strained relationships or any other factors that might hinder their occupational performance. So what do we do in terms of the focus for occupational therapy? The image on the right side is showing us the points where occupational therapy intervention can then start facilitating in order to improve the flow, creating or widening those spaces. By widening those spaces, then we then allow the flow to increase. What do we focus on when we are providing intervention using the Kawa model? So there are rocks, so we are focusing on breaking those rocks. In terms of the life situations or problems, we are identifying the challenges, exploring ways to make those challenges, to remove those challenges or to reduce those challenges. Then we also look at removing barriers. So some of the driftwood will be barriers or liabilities. We want to explore ways of removing those limitations to occupational performance and engagement. We're also focusing on maximizing the spaces, because by maximizing those spaces, we're actually enhancing or increasing the flow of the river. We also aim to promote the strengths and assets as well as the skills of individuals or community groups, depending on who our client is. And we do that by identifying these assets and then maximizing on those assets, personal assets as well. We also focus on enhancing the positive aspects and attributes. Probably the individual or the group of people, they have certain attributes, they have certain skills. We actually maximizing on those and enhancing those so that the flow of their life is not impeded or hindered. What do we do about the environment? We're looking at widening the river walls and the river beds. Are there things that we can do about the person's or the client's environment so that we can actually widen the river walls and beds so that we increase the flow? This is an image that sort of like illustrates if you like, the steps that you could follow when you're applying the Kawa model. So step 1 is about appreciating the client in context. So this model might not be applicable with other clients. So it's important at first to actually make a decision. Remember our OT philosophy, making a decision in terms of which conceptual model will be more appropriate to this client, depending on their context. And then we move on to step 2, where we clarify the context and the situation. At that stage, you might actually ask the client to actually draw how their river is looking like, the cross-section of their river, how it's looking like. And then step 3, we are looking at prioritizing issues according to the client's perspective. So once they've drawn the cross-section of their river, we are able then to have a discussion about the problems that they are encountering. We are able to identify their skills, their strengths, and then we can be able to prioritize maybe problems or challenges that needs to be addressed in priority order. And then we move on to step 4, where there is an assessment of focal points of occupational therapy intervention. What are the aspects of OT intervention? What is it that we can target in our OT intervention? If you think of the OT process, actually, you are looking at the parts of goal setting as well as intervention planning. And then from there, step 5 is now about implementing the interventions, the occupational therapy interventions. What are the interventions aiming to do? We're aiming to widen the river sides, widen the base. We're aiming to remove sediments or anything that is impeding flow. We're aiming to break the rocks. We're aiming to maximize on the spaces so that the flow of life can be enhanced. Next, step 6, which is evaluation. You can then, after implementing your interventions, you can then ask the client to draw again the cross-section of their river so that we can then be able to identify the differences between the initial drawing that they did before the interventions and then the interventions that the drawing that they did after the intervention. So that makes then the Kawa to be a useful tool that you can use like an outcome measure. You can use it at baseline, and then you can also use it post intervention for your evaluation. Here are some of the examples where the Kawa model has been used with clients. So as you can see in that image, they're actually showing what their problems are. By looking at the rocks, you can actually see that there's an issue of finances, there's a loss, there's stress, there is an issue of being unsure about the future. So they are looking at those things and considering them to be problems or challenges. And then if we look at the driftwood, there are examples like caring. So these are sort of like the assets that the person already has, which can actually then help the OT to collaborate with the client in order to find solutions of either breaking the rocks or removing the rocks altogether. That's another example as well for the cross-section of the river. Sometimes when you're working with clients, they might not draw the river as a cross-section. They might just draw the river across the page, and then they can label at different stages what is it that is going through, what is it that they are going through, or they can draw, they can illustrate in any way. That's the good thing about the Kawa model, because it allows for that creativity. That's another example of the Kawa model when it was used. This was a service development project in Scotland where a fraud service was actually being redesigned in collaboration with service users. So really, the Kawa model is applicable in a wide range of settings. At the bottom there is the website, Kawa website, which I encourage you to visit so that you can actually have a look at some of the examples, the case studies, the lectures, their posters. There is also a lot of publications on the application of the Kawa model. Okay, so these are my references. Thanks very much.